As a DJ, producer, or performer, you want a reliable system that works as you'd expect it to work. Traktor as a DJ software always provided you with a workflow that is very similar to a classic DJ setup while providing numerous additional creative features. The new remix decks are designed to behave like everything you already know about DJing, but at the same time, allow you to go so much further. This video will go into detail about the design and structure of Traktor's remix decks. Understanding the underlying workflow of the remix decks will help you develop an intuitive understanding of the system and its capabilities. With Traktor Pro 2.5, Native Instruments endeavored to make the remix deck respond to user interactions in the same way as a track deck does. You can play and pause a remix deck the same way you can play and pause a track deck. If you like to beat match tracks manually, then you're able to beat match remix decks manually. If you prefer to let Traktor automatically sync your tracks, Traktor will automatically sync the remix decks to the master deck by default. You can turn on scratch control and scratch a remix deck the same way you would a track deck. The sync and master buttons work for the remix deck in the same fashion that they work for track decks. Sync will make the remix deck match the tempo of the current tempo master, which can be any other deck or Traktor's master clock. The master button, when engaged, will select the remix deck as the tempo master. All decks and effects in Traktor will now follow the tempo and phase of the remix deck. You can play a remix deck with sync turned off. An internal timeline will make sure that all samples, no matter what tempo they originally have, will play in sync with each other, while the remix deck can remain unsynced from the rest of Traktor. Every sample is synced to the remix deck's tempo. The new quantize system in the remix decks helps you to ensure that all samples will be in time when they start to play. Each remix deck can have its own quantize setting, ranging from a quarter beat to 32 beats, that determines its behavior for all samples contained within the deck. With quantize on, the samples will wait until a certain amount of beats have passed until they start playing when triggered. When quantize is off, samples will begin playing the moment they're triggered by the user. The remix decks now have a huge grid of sample cells inside them. Each cell in this grid can hold one sample. A sample in the grid is split into two parts. The left side of the sample has a colored button showing the current playback type of the sample. The right portion shows the sample's name. Clicking on the colored button triggers the sample, while clicking on the name once selects the sample for editing the sample's settings. The grid is separated into 4 pages. Each page has a visible area of 4x4 in size, but the grid itself is actually 4x16 in size when you consider all 4 pages. The area of the grid that is visible in the remix deck is always the same as seen on the F1 controller. Each column of the sample grid is referred to as a slot in Traktor. At the top of each slot is a player, which can play one of the samples in the slot. While a sample is playing, the player will show the sample's waveform and will include a moving red playhead indicating the current playback position within the sample. While the sample grid provides an effective way to organize samples in the remix deck, each cell holds its own unique set of playback parameters for the contained sample. The properties of the cell override the behaviors embedded in the sample file. For example, a sample may be tagged as a loop when viewed in the collection, but the sample cell can be set to play that sample as a one-shot. You can also change parameters like the sample's trigger behavior, the fact whether it's synced to the remix deck or not, its pitch and gain values, or even give the sample a different tempo. This means you can take the same sample, load it into multiple cells, and give each cell different playback properties, opening up almost endless creative possibilities. To learn more about the different properties and behaviors, make sure to watch the Traktor Remix and Kontrol F1 tutorials. Considering that a remix deck can hold up to 64 samples, and that each can have its own set of playback properties, saving and recalling the contents of the remix deck is essential. Traktor Pro 2.5 allows you to save the contents of a remix deck as a remix set, which will appear in your Traktor collection. You can then drag this remix set into a remix deck to load it. All the needed samples will be located and loaded in the grid, along with all necessary playback settings. Remix sets are virtual references. These sets don't actually contain any audio sample data. Instead, they simply point to samples in the Traktor collection which should be loaded into the remix deck. Therefore, Traktor will prevent you from deleting any sample that has been used in a remix set. If you attempt to delete sample files that are used in a remix set, Traktor will warn you. A dialog box will open telling you the names of the sets using the samples. Unless you specifically mean to delete those samples, you can always cancel this process so that you don't break any of your remix sets.